So what's all the fuss about plant growth regulators anyway? Come with me for a deep dive on plant growth regulators, what they are, how they do what they do, and whether or not you should be using them in your garden. So plant growth regulators can be either organic or synthetic compounds, and what they do, as the name implies, is they regulate plant growth. But they do this by affecting or modifying the balance of phytohormones that are already present within a plant. So all plants growth is governed by phytohormones, of which there are 9 groups, but there are 5 that I'm going to briefly touch on here to help you understand what is actually happening when you use a plant growth regulator. So what are phytohormones? So phytohormones are signaling molecules that control all aspects of plant growth. And they exist in varying systems, and there are feedback loops, and they have connected relationship between each other, and all of that governs how a plant grows and what we visually see when the plant grows. So the first group of plant phytohormones that I would like to mention are the auxins. So auxins are responsible for phototropism, which is actually how they were originally discovered in a plant. So auxins sense where the light is coming from, and they inform the plant to orient their leaves and other tissues in relation to that light in the best possible position. So that's why auxin is what's responsible for the bending of stems that you might see if you're growing seeds in, say, a windowsill where the light is coming strictly from one side. That's auxin. Auxins are also involved in apical dominance, so plants' general growing upwards, coming up, is controlled by auxin as well. And when people manipulate by cutting the tops off of plants or maybe even bending plants, what you're really changing is the relative distribution of auxin in the plant. Auxins concentrate themselves at the uppermost tips. So if you have a plant that's growing up this way and all auxin is up here stimulating growth, you're not going to get very much growth of any auxiliary buds that are down here. Whereas if you were to bend that, and now all of a sudden this portion of the plant is sort of the top, if you like, now all of the auxin is concentrated evenly along this stem, and so you'll start to see each of the nodes grow upwards and form main stems, kind of like how the plant was originally growing prior to you cutting it. So now you've got, say, 2, or if you've bent over a stem, you might have 5 or 6 main stems that are growing upwards with that ordinary apical dominance. The next group to talk about would be the gibberellins, and you'll see why shortly. This will circle back to some of the synthetic plant growth regulators that you might have heard negative things about previously. So gibberellins are responsible for cell elongation in a plant, as well as the internodal distance. So if you've ever experienced a plant that you're growing which starts to stretch because it's looking for more light, that is a response that's governed by gibberellins. They're also critically important in seed germination. So with seed germination, the balance between gibberellins as well as abscisic acid and ethylene is what's going to trigger stimulation of germination or the inhibition of germination, keeping the seed dormant. That brings us to abscisic acid. So abscisic acid is the other molecule, the other plant growth regulator molecule that exists within seeds, and it is the crosstalk between abscisic acid and gibberellic acid and their relative concentrations that determine whether or not a seed stays dormant or if it starts to grow. Abscisic acid is also critical in stress responses in plants. So when a plant is starting to undergo drought or water stress in particular, the abscisic levels in the plant build to a critical point, and then that triggers the stomata, the pores on the undersides of the leaves, to close to prevent further water loss whilst the plant is in what it has determined to be a stressful environment. Cytokinins are another group which promotes cell division. So over here we had gibberellins that were encouraging cell elongation, Your cytokinins are encouraging cells to divide and multiply. They are also responsible for axillary growth. So I was talking before about auxins and how auxin essentially creates a plant that's just growing upwards with one main top. The ratio between auxin and cytokinins is part of what dictates this growth pattern. So if you were able to reduce the auxin levels below that of the cytokinins, you'd start to see more growth taking place further down on the plant, on those axillary nodes, than you would at the very top of the plant, where we're used to seeing most of our growth happening. The final plant phytohormone that I'd like to talk about is ethylene. Ethylene is involved in the ripening of fruit, and also in abscission, which is basically when the plant decides to drop a leaf. Ethylene is also involved in flower senescence, so the programmed natural death of a flower or the breakdown of a flower after it's finished doing its job. Let's have a look now at some of the common plant growth regulators that you might hear about or come across in Australia. So, all three of the plant growth regulators that I'm about to touch on now work in mostly the same way. So they are inhibiting gibberellin biosynthesis within plants. So as we learned previously, gibberellins are responsible for elongation of stems. They're also critically implicated in trichome development. And so when you use these products, you reduce the overall height, and that's typically why people would use them, reduce the overall height of crops. This can be beneficial if you're growing, say, ornamental flowers and plants where stretching tends to make the plant less marketable. So having the short, denser plants is desirable there. So let's have a look. So the first PGR that I would like to touch on is paclobutrazol. So paclobutrazol is approved for use on fruit trees, as well as for turf and hedging plants, where it is used to manage the height of those plants. Particularly in the fruit tree industry, reducing the overall height of the plant means that the plants are easier to manage. They're approved for use in very specific circumstances, this paclobutrazol. As I said, paclobutrazol inhibits gibberellin biosynthesis, so that's how it's working. Unfortunately, paclobutrazol is highly toxic to aquatic organisms. There are also concerns of fetal damage, so damage to developing fetuses in human beings with paclobutrazol. Most of these plant growth regulators, particularly the semi-synthetic plant growth regulators, will have some sort of known developmental toxicity that they have been displayed in mammal tests with these compounds. So the next one that I'd like to touch on is diminazide. Diminazide is one that people may have heard of before. It was actually banned from use on food crops in the late 80s in the US, and since then that has followed suit globally. So diminazide is used for ornamental plants. It's banned from food crops, and the reason is because it's actually classified as carcinogenic. So it's a known cancer-causing agent. Again, this compound works by inhibiting gibberellin biosynthesis. The last one I'd like to touch on is chlormequat. So chlormequat, again, you'll probably be starting to see some patterns here, is approved for use on ornamental plants as well as some cereal crops. In Australia, that's specifically wheat crops, and it's to help prevent them undergoing what's called lodging, which is where the stems fall over due to the long internodal spacing, and that severely reduces the harvestable quality of the crop. With chlormequat, again, there are scientific papers that demonstrate damage to or harm to reproductive and developmental systems in mammals, which of course includes us. These compounds, unfortunately, recently have been turning up a lot in the Californian medicinal plant supply market. They're actually banned for use in California in any way, shape, or form, especially for that particular reasons. When combusted, these products will produce nitrous oxides. So that could include nitrosamine, which is one of the most toxic compounds found in tobacco smoke. So what are some of the alternatives to the problematic plant growth regulators that I mentioned earlier? So let's go through 3 compounds that can be used to replace some of the effects and the impacts that plant growth regulators can have without any of the negative consequences. So the first one that I would like to introduce you to is triacontanol. Triacontanol is a naturally occurring plant growth regulator. It is a PGR. It's actually found in the waxy cuticle layer of plant leaves of some species, and it's also derived from beeswax. So triacontanol is associated and has demonstrated in studies significant yield increases, improving the overall biomass that a plant generates. And one of these studies included it was a 150% increase in the overall yield of a tomato cultivar that was treated with triacontanol. So triacontanol is a very promising plant growth regulator. So that brings us to salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is a naturally occurring phytohormone. It's actually present in plants already. What's interesting about salicylic acid is that if you provide an additional source of it, you can trigger the systemic acquired resistance pathways in plants, which is one of the 2 systems that plants use in order to combat pests and pathogens and to increase their resistance to those sorts of stresses. Salicylic acid is found naturally in willow plants as well as in aloe vera. It's actually the precursor compound or molecule to aspirin. So salicylic acid is remarkably safe, and it's a really great biostimulant for use in your garden. I like to use it once a week as an integrated pest management solution. It really increases resistance to pests and pathogens. So the final one is silicic acid. Now this sounds very similar, but they are distinct from the salicylic. So silicic acid is the bioavailable form of silica. So it's the only form of silica that plants can actively take up. Silicic acid is known to improve resistance to both abiotic and biotic stresses, so pests and pathogens like insects and mold, as well as the effects of an unideal environment. So things like drought stress, salinity, heavy metals, all of these issues are reduced and the overall growth of the plant is improved when using silicic acid. So these are the 3 compounds that, broadly speaking, I would look to in my crops if I was trying to achieve some of the stimulating growth aspects of plant growth regulators, because whilst they do inhibit gibberellin production, lots of them are associated with increases in yield or increased resistance to stresses, which is great, but when they are compounds that have carcinogenic risks or potential toxicities to developing fetuses, it's not something that I'd want to be using. So these are the 3 alternatives that I would recommend.